In my most recent video, which I'll link below, I argued that Republican politicians can be counted on to keep their economic promises more so than Dems. As I said in the video, this does not mean that Republican politicians can be trusted, that they're better people, that they're better for the country, or that you should vote for them. It also doesn't mean that they usually keep their promises. It was a systems and incentives-based argument that they can be expected to do what they say they will do more often than Dems, even if that rate is well below 50%. So maybe the Republicans will only keep 13% of their economic promises. If that's the case, I think there's good reason to think the Dems will keep even less than that. That's the argument. The reason for this, as I explained, is that there is greater philosophical overlap between the Republicans' donors, politicians, and the RNC on the one hand, and the Republican voters on the others, than is the case on the Democratic side. Whether you're a Dem or Republican vying for office, you need to win the favor of the big donors and the DNC or RNC. You do this, of course, by making deals with the donors in order to get their donations, which in turn will get you the favor of the DNC or RNC. You also need to win over the favor of regular citizens in order to, get their donations, but more importantly, to get their votes. This latter part is far easier for Republicans. Recall that the GOP emphasizes things like small government, low taxes, free enterprise, free markets, and personal responsibility, whereas the Democratic Party emphasizes government-facilitated compassion, advocacy, and aid for the less fortunate. In his much more balanced, earlier days, Jordan Peterson, someone whom I've both held as a hero and then lived long enough to see him become the villain, offered constructive views regarding the roles of the right and the left. Here's Peterson on the roles of the left and right when it comes to economics.
If you're going to pursue things of value in a social environment, you're going to produce a hierarchy. It's unavoidable because some people are better at whatever it is that you value. And so when that lays itself out socially, it will produce a hierarchy. The hierarchy has a necessity if you're going to pursue the things of value, but it has a risk. The risk is that we'll ossify and become corrupt. That's risk number one. And risk number two is that when you produce the hierarchy, you're going to dispossess a number of people because there'll be lots of people in the hierarchy who aren't good at it and they'll be dispossessed. So you need a political voice for them. That's the left. Now, what the right does is say, yeah, but we still need the hierarchy. It's like, yes, you still need the hierarchy. The reason we need the political dialogue is because we need the hierarchy and we can't let it get out of control.
So to summarize, part of the reason that we need the right is that there are things that we value, and competence-based hierarchies are natural emergent phenomena that help us get more of that stuff. However, this benefit does come with costs, and one of those costs is that any hierarchy will leave some people behind. These people need a voice, and per Peterson, this voice is supposed to be the left. It's very easy to see that when it comes to economics, Republicans have a much easier job. They advocate for the hierarchy. And when you advocate for the hierarchy, you are going to disproportionately attract people who are doing well in the hierarchy and thus have the money and motivation to conserve it. But when they donate to pro-hierarchy candidates, they may want something in return. Lower taxes on high earners, capital gains and corporations, favorable regulatory policies, and so on. What is more, given that high-level politicians are also affluent and invest more than most, and also may hope to secure lucrative employment, consulting, or corporate speaking gigs after leaving office, they personally benefit directly from these sorts of policies too. And here's where the Republican advantage kicks in. They can sell the policies that they've promised their donors and the RNC to their voters on the grounds that they are shrinking government, lowering taxes, unfettering the free market, and rewarding excellence and personal responsibility. On the Dem side, everything is pretty much the same as on the right, except that instead of advocating for the hierarchy, they're supposed to be advocating for people who are being left behind. But how do you advocate for those at the bottom when you are dependent upon, have more to gain from, and have more shared interests with those at the top. I mean, you could go rogue, but then you'd have both parties, the lobbyists, donors, super PACs, and the legacy media all trying to tear you down. No wonder Dems can't deliver on affordable, accessible healthcare and education, or the growing gap between the very rich and the rest. The system as built will destroy them were they to ever seriously try. But still, they keep getting votes. Let's try to figure out why. Well, let's do the easy stuff first. There's the lesser of two evils. Depending on what is important to you, one party will probably be at least somewhat better than the other. The Democrats, for example, probably won't do nearly as much as you want them to do if you're a Democrat on environmental policy, but they'll definitely do more than the Republicans. Then there's the hope factor. The Democratic Party probably won't get you that $15 minimum wage. Well, at least not until inflation makes it to the point where that will, in effect, become the going rate anyhow. But the Republicans definitely won't. The 2016 election, I think, was a case where hope played up. Trump, I think, offered for many hope. He was independently wealthy and famous. He did not need Washington or political office to continue to make big money. And so conceivably, maybe he wouldn't be as dependent upon the establishment as other candidates. And given his patent narcissism and need to be praised, maybe he won't sell us out, if for no other reason than to go down in history as a fantastic president, which will always be good for the ego. But with Hillary Clinton, there was no maybe. She's been on retainer for the big donors since the late 90s. And then, of course, there's hot button cultural issues. Quick clarification, the things I'm about to discuss, the cultural issues, they are not unimportant. They are important. The problem is that they are being used to distract us by both sides. If you have a strong stance, one way or the other, on abortion, guns, or social justice related causes, this alone could determine who you vote for. And both parties lean heavily into these things. Why? Well, first off, for every minute that we're talking about transgender bathroom issues, we are not talking about the cost of post-secondary education and medicine. And every minute that we're talking about Roe v. Wade is a minute that we're not talking about Citizens United and the American system of legislated political bribery. And what is more, whether we go one way or the other on any of these issues, it's not going to cost Pfizer or Raytheon anything. Increasing taxes on corporations and high earners, that will cost them. Policy to lower drug prices or the defense budget, that will cost them too. But having male to female transgender athletes take over female sports is totally budget neutral. It should not be a surprise then that the Democratic Party has largely substituted class politics for identity politics, leaning into what has been dubbed cultural Marxism by some on the right. Traditional Marxism is a method of socioeconomic analysis that invites the thinker to divide the population into two primary groups, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The bourgeoisie is the wealthy, powerful class that owns the means of production, the factories, land, industrial equipment, and so forth. And the proletariat are the individually powerless, relatively poor workers of the world who must work for the powerful owners in order to eat. Marxism predicts that there will be a tendency toward increasing exploitation of the proletariat by the bourgeoisie, which will eventually lead the proletariat to develop class consciousness, unite along class lines, and launch a people's revolution that will take the means of production from the small, wealthy ownership class and put them into control of a socialist government that, in an ideal world, will represent the interests of the people. Starting within academia, but then spreading into the broader culture, many modern leftists have grafted this conceptual framework from the economic realm to the demographic realm. From a starting point of the powerful oppressive bourgeoisie and the noble oppressed proletariat, we get the powerful and oppressive male and the noble and oppressed female, the powerful and oppressive whites and the noble and oppressed anything but Asian non-whites, the powerful and oppressive cisgender straights, and the noble and oppressed trans, gay, and lesbian communities. The Democratic Party has leaned into this supplanting of class politics with identity politics as a solution to their biggest problem. Their voters want to help average people and the less fortunate, even if it's at the expense of the wealthy and the corporations, whereas many of their wealthy individual and corporate donors, as well as high-level politicians, want to help themselves, even if it's at the expense of average people and the less fortunate. Identity politics is being leveraged as a way out of this jam. Instead of going hard in the paint on healthcare, education, defense spending, and money in politics, on the basis of demographics, they are hiring black women as the vice president, press secretary, and the latest Supreme Court justice. They're hiring a grossly underqualified gay man as the new secretary of transportation. They're throwing on a kente cloth, taking a knee on Parliament Hill, calling the other side bigots, and then calling it a day. They've substituted wokeness, which costs their donors nothing, for class advocacy, which would have cost them a lot. You can see Hillary Clinton laying it on very thick here.
If we broke up the big banks tomorrow, and I will, if they deserve it, if they pose any systemic risk, I will. Would that end racism? No. Would that end sexism? No. Would that end discrimination against the LGBT community?
And I wouldn't have taken her statements that she would break up the big banks very seriously, given the tens of millions of dollars that she has received from them since the 90s. And it's not just the politicians. Even popular progressive commentator Joy-Ann Reid has gotten in on the action.
The only people I ever hear use the word inflation are journalists and economists, right? So that is not part of the normal lexicon of the way people talk. So it's interesting that Republicans are doing something they don't normally do, right? Which is not use the common tongue, right? Not use just common English to sort of do on their campaigns like they're doing with crime. But what they've done is they've taught people the word inflation, right? Yeah. Most people who would have never used that word ever in their lives are using it now because they've been taught.
Wow. And of course, who are the people most hurt by inflation? The poor. But hey, she's a black woman with the right opinions on identity politics, so no problem. Anyhow, between this rainbow washing and the aforementioned lesser of two evils and hope factors, the Dems continue to get votes even though they continually fail to deliver on purpose on the most important issues. And if you're a Republican, don't be feeling smug. Your politicians are playing a similar game, the same game. They get your votes by riding on hot-button cultural issues like guns and abortion, and by speaking in alignment with philosophies that you admire, but they're just as in the pocket of their big donors as are the Dems. And unsurprisingly, now you can see many of them leaning into anti-wokeness just as hard as a lot of Dems are leaning into wokeness. They're playing the same game as Dems, they're just on the other team. They're the red team, the Dems are the blue team, the donors are the season ticket holders, and the rest of us, we're the ball. They may keep their economic promises more often, but this doesn't mean that they're usually following through on what they say they will do, and it doesn't mean that they're actually fighting for you or for any sort of principle. You may not agree with Democrats on a lot, but I imagine that you also don't like that your politicians are being bought off, or that you're paying more for education, healthcare, and meds than the rest of the developed world. And maybe you also don't like that the US's military budget exceeds that of the next 9 highest spending countries combined. Like, aren't those dollars that could have gone toward infrastructure, helping veterans, or simply back into your pocket? So what's the solution? I don't know. But I think a good start would be getting more people to realize that they are being distracted, manipulated, and divided by the parties, politicians, big donors, big tech, and the news media. Stop letting them get you so mad at the other side that you don't notice that your own side is not even on your side, and that you probably have much more common ground with regular people on the other side than you think. Seek out good faith commentators and people that you can talk to from different perspectives so that you can see why they think and feel the way they do, rather than simply writing them off as being stupid, ignorant, or evil. Try to understand their values so that you can see the world from their perspective in addition to your own, and then help them return the favor to you by sharing with them, sort of how you see the world and, the nature of your perspective. Instead of focusing on areas of disagreement, search for common ground. because you're often going to find it. You may not agree on BLM or abortion, but you probably agree that it's a problem that politicians are being bought off. Be the adult in the room. If someone else is being unconstructive or disingenuous, don't sink to that level. Point out that you are trying to be civil and have a good faith conversation, and the only way that this can continue is if they return the favor. If they're not willing to reciprocate, leave. Relatedly, wherever practical, avoid text-based communication. Do it in person, by video chat, or over the phone. The psychological distance and anonymity of text-based communication often brings out the worst in us. It's also extremely conducive of misunderstandings and other failures of communication that will frustrate everyone and further motivate toxic behavior that just divides you further and, keeps the walls up. And lastly, start finding more value in deep relationships outside of politics. Connect more deeply with family and friends. Get deeply involved in a tight-knit community and try to give more than you get within it. Try to stay where you're from and foster connections with your community. Be a good neighbor. Then, when political disagreements come up, both sides will be more motivated to be constructive, and it will be much more difficult and unappealing for either person to write the other person off as being stupid, ignorant, or evil. All right, so that is the end of this one. Thanks as always for giving me some of your time, and if you're looking for more non-toxic, good faith, intentionally balanced consideration of these difficult sorts of issues, take a look around this channel and, of course, subscribe.